Hello, this is Jimmy Mitchell, and we are back in an episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have the macro roots of China's trade surplus the tariffs won't reach from Cato.org, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I would agree that, China has some unnatural advantages when it comes to trade, especially with how it can produce a lot of things for cheaper than you can here. But that's not an excuse for excess taxes when it comes to Chinese-made goods. I personally don't really care for China and how when it comes to stuff like solar panels, it receives government subsidies for that. But, ultimately, if people want to buy something from China, especially because it's cheaper, then they can get it for here. I think they should be able to. With libertarian positions, you shouldn't have any taxes or tariffs, and you buy whatever you want to. I personally don't really think, I think you should probably be trying to support the local economy rather than the Chinese economy, but ultimately, it shouldn't be the government's say on what you pay, rather it should be what the free market has in regards to that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have latest spy powers proposal doesn't have warrant requirement demanded by critics from thehill.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but the government can spy on you however it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it, and that doesn't even count foreign governments and private companies as well. They probably do a lot of spying on you also. Next we have encounters with Gen X, posted by Impassionata, and they said, I've had a lot of success driving age-related decline as the proximate cause of political dysfunction. Trump is a Nazi-style fascist. That much is clear to America after 1/6, but why wasn't 1/6 enough? That's where geriatric politicians come in. Geriatric feeble-mindedness, easily cowed, think Murkowski getting bullied into voting for the ICE Gestapo Act. Trump's reckless vote violence is a feature for his fascist followers. Remember, the fascism as much as in the people around Trump as it is in Trump. So how does society that was enraged by Biden's age fail to make an issue of Trump's age? I think the answer is simple. Elderly Democratic lawmakers and oligarchs, Pelosi, have a depth grip on the party. They chose a suicidal for the country strategy of let Trump destroy the country so win the 2026 midterms. This sniveling cowardice may well be rewarded at the ballot box, but only after massive consequences for the entire goddamn globe. In other words, the selfish lack of reflection of geriatric Democrats is blamed for the Democrat strategy of weakness and firmly worded letters. 79% of Americans want age caps, and they have a few more paragraphs. And yeah, personally, I think, age caps are anti-democratic when it comes to elections. But, just like with term limits, I think, just because something's democratic doesn't necessarily make it good. I think age caps would be a good thing when it comes to, we shouldn't be electing people over a certain age. And yeah, I don't think it's democratic, but, just because something democratic doesn't necessarily make it good. Democracy is simply tyranny of the majority and mob rule. And that's, I think libertarian perspective is you gotta get rid of democracy and have people freely associating with one another rather than the forced collectivist system that we have currently of having a centralized state in charge of everything. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have A Tale of Two post, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a screenshot of two headlines from the Washington Post. One of the headline is, The Texas Gerrymander Freakout. The other headline is, Virginia plunges America deeper into the gerrymandering abyss. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, I can give you tons of example of the headlines going the other way when the headline is for the first one is very much against the Republicans, but the headline is for the second one is very much for the Democrats. This is kind of an opposite example. It just goes to show you that, ultimately, people are going to spin things to their agenda, and usually that's very much how politics works, I would say. But in reality, I think it's pretty much all just theater. The Uniparty is, neither branch of the Uniparty is really going to be on your side. Ultimately, they're just controlled opposition to keep people distracted from the fact that the deep state is really the one running the country, I would say, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have Biden killed the Spirit Airlines merger. Now Trump wants taxpayers to save the company, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think Spirit Airlines should have been allowed to merge with whatever company wanted to merge with. So, and I don't think, but I don't think taxpayers should be forced to save the company if they don't want to. I think if people do want to earmark their taxpayer dollars to Spirit Airlines, they should be able to, people should be able to send their taxpayer dollars wherever they want to if the government thinks that's a cause that should be worth doing. But ultimately, I would say the libertarian perspective is but it's the government's fault that for both of these things, and I would say that it would have been better if the government just stayed out of Spirit Airlines entirely, rather than get us into the situation that they're now in a fit. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have new acting Navy Secretary once warned of witchcraft in California City. Wiccans have taken over, from AL.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's cross-post from the Not the Onion subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for witchcraft, but if you want to do witchcraft, you should be able to do so. I think witchcraft's very demonic and unholy, but you justify doing whatever you want to justify. Also, I used to think demons probably weren't real, but then, Reddit is definitely a very demon-infested website, I would say. And, a lot of people are saying Trump is the Antichrist. I would say, Reddit is probably the Antichrist, especially with how demon-infested it is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, ever wonder where your tax dollars go? Now you can see exactly which businesses receive federal grants, SBA loans, and state subsidies. We've built a searchable database tracking over 55,000 plus from X.com, posted by Mazda Profit. And that's looks like a tweet from Andrew Torba introducing YouFundThis.com, a government funding transparency tracker. And yeah, personally, I think that's a good idea. People should be able to know where their taxpayer dollars go to, and so I definitely do think that's a good idea, that you should be tracking where taxpayers go to, especially since it's public funds. They should be publicly accountable for where they're going to. Next, we have, after Viktor Orban's defeat in Hungary, the new right needs a new foreign despot to admire, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Viktor Orban, but ultimately, Reddit just doesn't like Viktor Orban because he's out-group rather than in-group. They love Xi Jinping since he's in-group rather than out-group, since, he's more considered a left-leaning authoritarian. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit, they don't have any principles. They love authoritarians when they're on their side, but if they're in the out-group, suddenly they're the worst thing ever. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have, DeSantis wants to eliminate real estate taxes on your homestead. In 7 years, real estate taxes have increased from $32 billion to $60 billion, posted by Mazda Profit. And that looks like a tweet from Graham Bensinger tweeted, they went from $32 billion to $60 billion in 7 years. Governor DeSantis wants to give it back. Florida homeowners may soon pay zero on property taxes. Here's how he plans to do it, at Governor Ron DeSantis. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if you should be forced to pay zero, you should be paying zero in any taxes that you don't want to. If you don't want to pay property taxes, you shouldn't be forced to pay property taxes. Same with any other kind of tax. Taxation is inherently theft. If you consent to taxes, I think that's fine, but you shouldn't be forced to pay them if you don't want to. Next, we have, Trump administration approves firing squad executions for death penalty, from nytimes.com, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they added, the Trump administration said on Friday that would allow firing squads and readopt lethal injection as part of a broader push to revive the death penalty. The report the Justice Department issued as part of the announcement said the Bureau of Prisons should follow the example of states that had expanded the air execution protocols amid fights over the legality and legality of lethal injection drugs. The additional manners of execution that BOP should consider adopt include the firing squad, electrocution, and lethal gas, each of which the Supreme Court has found to be consistent with the 8th Amendment, the report said, referring to a part of the Bill of Rights as far as cruel and unusual punishment. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the death penalty. I don't think the state should be killing people regardless of how guilty they are. But ultimately, the state can justify whatever it wants to justify. If it wants to kill you for any reason, it can justify it. And personally, I would say the death penalty should at the very least be voluntary rather than coerced, regardless of how bad a crime someone has committed. But regardless, you do have to remember that they are taking up resources as well. People do need to eat food, and so that's an important point to remember as well. Ultimately, I would say that maybe something like starvation. If a prisoner doesn't want to work or it could be something that could work for the death penalty. You know, that might be a bit more of a crueler death, but ultimately all deaths are going to be cruel to some extent. Maybe for anyone who gets the death penalty on a prison island and force them to fight for their survival. You know, ultimately, I don't like how one of the biggest problems with the death penalty is it takes individual autonomy away. You know, maybe for hunt them down on an island, like I said earlier, you know, maybe like the most dangerous game scenario, but ultimately, you know, the state can justify doing whatever it wants in regards to the death penalty, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. You know, it's not something I personally care for, especially since the state's the one doing it, but, you know, ultimately the state can justify whatever it feels like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have allowing censorship of military retirees like Senator Mark Kelly would set a chilling and dangerous precedent from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, you know, I don't really care for censorship, but I think it's interesting. Reddit loves censorship when it's against the out group, but the second the in groups get censored, they start bitching and crying out against freedom of speech. You know, they're like, no one is entitled to a platform, Chud, and they're also like, no, CBS just can't cancel my favorite propaganda show like that when Colbert gets canceled. And it just goes to show you that, you know, Reddit, you know, they have no values other than in-group good, out-group bad. If it was, the subreddit brands itself as Uncensored, but I've been banned for almost 2 years now, and it just goes to show you that, you know, these people have no principles, only teams. You know, censorship's practically their religion at this point. They hate freedom of speech, but suddenly they get censored and they're all about freedom of speech. They're a bunch of phonies. That's what they are. Next, we have White House mules using Defense Production Act in Spirit Airlines takeover from CBSNews.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be taking over any private business, but ultimately the government can take over any business it wants to, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have UK imposes lifetime smoking ban for people born after 2009 from DailySignal.com, posted by Mazda Prophet. And yeah, personally, I think, you know, if people want to smoke, they should be able to smoke. I think it's interesting. Reddit loves smoking when it comes to weed, but they hate smoking when it comes to tobacco. I think the libertarian position is, you know, prohibition doesn't work. Smoke or drink whatever you want to. Do whatever you want to for your own body. If you want to do alcohol, tobacco, heroin, cocaine, do whatever you want to. You know, it's your body, your choice. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have civil liberties groups sue for information on ICE's speech-chilling subpoenas, posted from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for speech censorship as I went over, but Reddit only doesn't like ICE's speech-chilling because ICE is in the out-group rather than the in-group. I'm sure if it was an in-group agency doing censorship, Reddit would love it and think it's the greatest thing ever or sweep it under the rug. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Tennessee lawmakers pass bill allowing use of deadly force to protect property from WSMV.com, posted by Mazda Prophet. And yeah, personally, I think, you know, if people want to use deadly force to protect their property, I think they should be able to. I would agree with this bill, you know, justify using force for whatever you feel like, as long as, you know, it's in self-defense. You know, ultimately, you know, you should, if someone breaks into your house and you want to justify attacking them, I think you have every right to, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have 9 out of 10 USA dollars spent in 2022 went to contractors, mostly in the DC area. Less than 1 in 10 went to frontline groups from X.com, posted by Mazda Prophet, and that's a tweet from WikiLeaks about that says just that. And yeah, personally, just go to show you how corrupt the government is. You know, if the government wants to just funnel money into progressive NGOs, it can do so. And of course, Reddit always says, "Oh, Trump's enriching himself with the job, and enriching his friends and allies too." But you know, when it's on their side, does it? When the woke Democrats funnel all their money into woke progressive NGOs, Reddit sweeps it under the rug or says that's a good thing, fascist chud. And it just goes to show you these people have no principles, only teams. They love when their side grifts, but suddenly the other side grifts, and it's the worst thing ever. You know, politics is inherently grift, I would say, and that's why I think people shouldn't fund it if they don't want to. It's all pretty much just a giant grift, and that's just my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas Tech establishes draconian new censorship policies on LGBTQ topics from truthout.org, posted by Nick Concussions, and they said, in addition to restricting classroom instruction, the new memo extends content censorship to student out research as well. A new memo at Texas Tech University establishes a sweeping and draconian censorship policy toward LGBTQ plus people, creating a campus equivalent of Don't Say Gay, one of the most extreme anti-speech policies ever imposed at a public university. The memo bars professors from discussing LGBTQ plus topics in core and lower level courses and eliminates entire field study across the 5 university system. It even requires that an industry standard textbook includes content on sexual orientation or gender identity. Instructors must skip over it and avoid a discussion about it. Most troubling, however, is that the censorship regime extends beyond professors to students themselves. The memo states that no degrees for accumulating student research within the TTU system will be permitted to center on SOGI topics, a total ban on LGBTQ plus mentions in dissertations or graduate thesis work. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but Reddit loves censorship when it's against their political enemies. This guy's had me blocked for months on end, but that's good censorship to them. But suddenly their topics get censored, and it's the worst thing ever. I remember Amazon.com banned kind of a racist book, The Camp of the Saints, recently, and the banned book subreddit was celebrating it, even though they said they're supposed to be against banned books. Reddit just wants censorship of what it doesn't like. Well, thinking censorship against what it's like is the worst thing ever. And ultimately, it's a smallest violin moment. You support censorship for years when it was against the out group, but suddenly you get censored, and ultimately, I'm just gonna play a song on the smallest violin. It's phony. That's what it is. These people love censorship, but suddenly their woke shit gets censored, and it's the worst thing ever. Next, we have the rise of third-party power will happen sooner than you might think. From thehill.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And I personally doubt that. I think 40% of the people are going to vote Republican no matter what. 40% of the people are going to vote Democrat no matter what. And that just really leaves only 20% of people left. And ultimately, I don't, it just goes to show you that people, are just going to keep falling into these bipartisan narratives forever. They'll ultimately say, like, our side is ineffective and weak and it's not doing anything, but the other side is so much worse. And it just goes to show you, as long as people keep buying into this rhetoric, it's not going to end. And sadly, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. I think the country's more likely to collapse than the third party ever gain meaningful traction, I would say, in regards to the U.S. election systems, particularly in regard to the presidency. Next, we have, if the 2028 presidential election were held today, who would you vote for? Posted by Jacob Anders, and that's across post from the Polls subreddit. And their options were Jacob Anders, Democrat; J.D. Vance, Republican; Jill Stein, Green; Chase Oliver, Libertarian. I'd probably go for Chase Oliver again, because I went for him in 2024, and I don't trust the Democratic or Republican parties, and I think the Green Party is a bit more progressive for my taste. But yeah, personally, I definitely don't think, they're not going to it will be a corporate Democrat rather than this Redditor who had himself as the Democratic nominee, rather than, I personally asked him if I could be his vice president, because, I disagree with him a lot, but, I definitely do want to get on the presidential ticket in my lifetime, so that's something I'm pretty with that being said, if voting really mattered, the people really running the show wouldn't let us do it. So, I don't really think it matters who you vote for. The same deep state's always going to win. As George Carlin famously said, big club, you ain't in it. Next, we have New York buffer zone would let police arrest people who get too close. From CBS New York, from CBSNews.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Bad Cop No Donut subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but ultimately the police can justify arresting people for whatever they feel like. They're the ones with legal monopoly on these supports on their side. Next, we have 8 hate groups leaders, including KKK, Imperial Wizard, and Neo-Nazi, got millions from SPLC as part of informant scheme from NYPost.com, posted by Mazda Prophet. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, the demand for racism exceeds the supply of it. The SPLC needs to pump money into hate groups so they can say hate's getting worse. But that's not really what's happening. People get less hateful over the years, I would say. But of course, Reddit always needs needs to make people think people or make everyone think hate and bigotry is rising, even though Reddit labels aim to send all as hate or bigotry. So ultimately, I think the libertarian perspective is the SPLC. It's not your friend. It definitely shouldn't be getting taxpayer dollars, but it's a private corporation. If it wants to fund hate groups, it should be able to. But I definitely do think it should be held accountable for that, and I definitely wouldn't donate my money there if I were someone who would donate money to groups like that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have the world's largest arcade is Libertarian owned, and of course located in New Hampshire, posted by Amugus Devilman, and that's cross-post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And that's a screenshot of the fun spot. It says, a government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything you have. And they added, opened and but operated by Bob Lawman, a former state rep known for his pro-liberty approach. He passed a few years back. It's now operated by his cousin and son, who, as you can see, maintains libertarian messaging. On every screen on the same billboard reads, "Who is John Galt?" And yeah, personally, I think libertarians should be able to operate whatever business they want to. If they want to operate an arcade, they should be able to. Ultimately, as long as people aren't forced to go there if they don't want to, libertarians should be able to do whatever they feel like. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think let's see if there's anything new. Looks like that's it for all the new stuff. So we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.